Well, hello everyone. Welcome to today's webinar entitled Foliar Diseases of Wheat, Prioritizing Importance and Their Management. I'm Chris Boomsma, Director of Education here at the American Society of Agronomy. It is my privilege to moderate today's webinar, to introduce it, and to help with the question and answer period. But we do have a nice slate of speakers with us today, and so we're going to get started because we've got a lot of material to present. Before I get started though, with the presentation day, first, I want to take time, as always, to acknowledge our sponsor. This larger series is sponsored by the Crop Protection Network, a product of land-grant universities. So their generous sponsorship of this series brings to you quality education in pest management, and it brings it to you free of charge, which is just wonderful. Note that the sponsorship of this webinar, as with the rest of the series, does not imply endorsement by the American Society of Agronomy. Okay, moving on to a few important housekeeping items that I want to really point out. And the first one is the most important. If you are having any issues with GoToWebinar registration, maybe CEU concerns, please reach out first to Lacey Edwardson, my colleague. She's standing by, ready to take your questions. If you can only see my screen but not hear me, you might want to go with either of those options. But if you can hear me but not see my screen, the number you're going to call is 608-268-4953. Okay, this webinar is worth one CEU in pest management or professional meetings, but that depends on your certification. So that is what you should be receiving upon conclusion of this event. Please type your questions in the questions box and submit them to me at any time. We will have a 10-minute question and answer period roughly at the end of this webinar, and you can submit any moments. I'll be organizing those questions and posing them to our presenters at the end of the webinar. Note that this training session is being recorded. You will have access to both the recording and the slides about 1 week after this live event. Often though, that happens sooner. Of course, be looking out for future webinars offered by the American Society of Agronomy. In the coming months, we'll have many of them as we go through January, February, and March, many of them free of charge, so we hope you can join. Again, we are broadcasting this single webinar today, but it is part of a larger series. You can go to the link that you see on the screen at this time and see the other webinars that are a part of this larger series on pest management. Please join for all of them. A lot of great material. Okay, now I'm going to be introducing our 4 panelists today with us. And as I introduce them, they're going to be turning on their webcams, and they'll have them on for the remainder of the time so we have a little bit more interaction. Now, our first speaker today is Andrew Friskop. He's an extension plant pathologist and associate professor at North Dakota State University. His research and extension program focuses on updating the management recommendations for diseases of cereal crops, such as bacterial leaf streak of wheat. Andrew started his work in IPM. The need for disease diagnosis inspired him to pursue applied research in plant pathology. He has a bachelor's degree in crop and weed science and a PhD in plant pathology from North Dakota State University. Thank you, Andrew, for being with us today. Our second panelist for today is Boyd Padgett, who is an extension and research plant pathologist and professor at LSU. He specializes in disease identification and management in corn, cotton, grain sorghum, peanut, soybean, wheat, and oats. Prior to working at LSU, he worked in the extension program at the University of Georgia. He has a bachelor's degree in ag business from Louisiana Tech University, a master's in plant path from the University of Georgia, and a PhD in plant pathology from LSU. So Boyd, thank you for being with us today. Our third speaker is Kelsey Anderson Onofre, who is an assistant professor and extension specialist at Kansas State University. Her research is in applied wheat pathology with an emphasis on integrated management, epidemiology, and pathogen population dynamics. She obtained a bachelor's degree in biology from Lafayette College, a master's in plant path from Ohio State University, and a PhD in plant pathology from University of Florida. And she previously worked at Monsanto as a plant pathologist. So welcome, Kelsey. Our final speaker is Emmanuel Byamukama, who's an associate professor and extension plant pathologist at South Dakota State University. In this role, he focuses on disease epidemiology in wheat and soybean. And a major component of his research explores the efficacy and timing of products to manage fungal and bacterial diseases in wheat. As a postdoc at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, he researched the impact and distribution of viral diseases in wheat. He has a bachelor's in agriculture, master's in crop science, and a PhD degree in plant path from Iowa State University. So welcome, Emmanuel. Wonderful. It's great to have all of you with us today. We're looking forward to this presentation. And with that, I'm going to make you presenter, Andrew. And when you're ready, sir, just go right ahead and show your slides and kick off this great webinar. Take it away.
Good day, everyone. I guess depends where you're at. But today I had the privilege of recruiting a very good panel, and the goal of this is I know we deal with a lot of wheat diseases in the state or in the U.S. and in respective states. So I wanted to tap 3 experts on what diseases are important in their area. And then more importantly, how can we look at management for some of the applied research? So I'm going to start in Louisiana, and I'm going to first turn it over to Dr. Boyd Padgett and kind of a representation of what he has going on as far as diseases in Louisiana.
Thanks, Andrew. Again, greetings, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Greetings from the deep south. Today, I want to visit with you a little bit about leaf and stripe rust, how to identify these 2 diseases, the importance they play in Louisiana, and also talk about some recommended management practices for leaf rust. Next slide, please. You might wonder how these diseases become established in the United States. This is from the USDA ARS Cereal Disease Lab. Rust spores are blown into the United States and they're deposited on wheat. They establish infections and they spread from the southern part of the United States up into the north. And you can see the distribution in the green across the United States. So rust are very significant problems in wheat. Next slide. Okay, let's start with leaf rust. It's caused by the fungus Puccinia trudicina. It's an obligate parasite, which means it has to have a living host to survive. The conditions that favor its development are going to be 15 to 25 degrees Celsius or 60 to 77 degrees Fahrenheit. All rusts are going to need some leaf wetness, usually about 6 to 8 hours of leaf wetness to establish germination and infection. In Louisiana, we usually see leaf rust signs and symptoms start around mid to late March. Occasionally we see them a little bit earlier, but usually, based on my research, mid to late March is when we see this particular disease. Next slide. Okay, I kind of want to cover the disease and life cycle for this particular pathogen. And what we see is a lot of different spores, but the most important spore, and if you want to hit the cycle, is going to be the Uridinea spores that are blown in. Occasionally we get some ACL spores, but they're not really a big player as far as leaf rust epidemics. These spores, the Uridinea spores, have a latent period of about 7 to 14 days, and that means that after they infect and establish a successful infection on the leaf, within about 7 to 14 days, that fungus has produced a pustule and is also producing more spores for other infections. Next slide. Doing good, Andrew. So you may wonder what kind of losses that we see in the United States and also in Louisiana specifically. According to the USDA, losses are typically about 1 to 20%, which can be very significant. However, in individual fields, we may see up to 50%, say in susceptible varieties. I looked at some of my tests and my yield losses range from about 10 to 60% in susceptible varieties. And overall, they average about 26%. So pretty significant disease impacting yield in our state. Next slide. Okay, so how does this disease get started? Usually the initial symptoms, the pustules that you'll see, the little kind of cinnamon brown, and this is also referred to as brown rust. It's going to start in the lower canopy. And the reason being is the leaf wetness period is usually extended in those shaded areas as opposed to the upper canopy. You'll see the in the middle picture, the kind of chlorotic lesions on the leaf blade. As those infections continue to develop, you'll get the pustule, as you see in the lower right-hand corner. Next slide. And this is a beautiful picture to a plant pathologist. You got to be careful when you go into the field and you're visiting with growers. You don't want to get too excited, but these are the actual pustules, and you'll see thousands of spores within each pustule. Okay. As the disease begins and continues to develop, you'll have new infections on the leaf blade. The pustules continue to increase. You'll get coalescing, and if you look in the bottom of the slide, you'll see actually the leaf becomes desiccated and it impacts yield. So in Louisiana, and really with any disease management program in any crop, it's going to begin with genetic resistance. And we have a robust variety testing program for wheat in the state. And we encourage our producers to certainly choose high yielding, well adapted, disease resistant varieties. And this does not come to any additional cost as opposed to growing a susceptible variety. And you may avoid a fungicide application. However, if you if you have a new race develop, and I think we had some new races develop in strike rust this year, but at any rate, if you're forced to take other measures, that would be fungicides. And fungicides are usually applied at F8, that would be flag leaf, or up into boot growth stage of the wheat. And the fungicides are pretty effective. These are the locations where we look at the our official variety tests. We also do on-farm tests with growers as well. I have several of those out right now. We typically plant wheat in October and November. So our season, we're kind of on the front end of our season at the moment. But these 7 different locations represent different environments, soil types, and things such as that. So producers, consultants, they can look at fields that are most represented by these locations when making variety selections. Next slide. This information is published every year in our small grain performance trials. I'll mention these and you can hit the next slide or the next. We don't apply fungicides, so we record any kind of naturally occurring diseases on these various varieties. It gives us an idea certainly of how resistance plays, and of course we take these trials to yield at the end of the growing season. So this is an annual publication. We also do fungicide screening studies. As I took this as kind of representing, we have Propamax, which is a triazole fungicide. We have 2, the Quilt XL and the Stratego Yield, which are premixes of a strobilurin and triazole. And then we have 2 strobies on the bottom. I mentioned the propiconazole has been around forever, and it's still pretty effective if you look at the disease ratings. Some I want you to look at on the non-treated, just to kind of give you an idea of just how fast this rust spreads. 5.4%, 12 days later, 91%. So very aggressive disease. The fungicides did a very good job. All of them did, some better than others. If you look at the premixes and also the approach, did a pretty good job. Looking at the F8 application with the tilt, or the Propamax, the yields were better where we had the premix. So the fungicides are all effective, but they're not all equal. Next slide. Okay. We had mixed infections in this particular test. Couple of things. Again, the fungicides were very effective. The Nexicor and the Trivapro are actually 3 modes of action. All of the fungicides provide a good yield preservation. These are the F8 applications, as you can see. Again, some fungicides like the Trivapro perform better than the others. But if you look, go ahead and hit the. If you look at the F10 timings, just mainly look at the Prosaro, application timing can make a difference. So just kind of keep that in mind. These epidemics may have been extended a little bit longer than if it would have been just one rust alone. Rust don't discriminate. Sometimes you get both rust in the same field, and these epidemics progress. Matter of fact, if you look at the yields for the applications that were made at Boot at F10, they were actually better than some of the applications at F8. Okay. So you may wonder, and I think it's important, just how long do these fungicides last? So you're going to put your application out. When is that fungicide going to break down? Again, they're not all the same, but in general, for most of these products, with maybe the exception of Trivapro, they started breaking out at about 14 days. Sometimes you get a little bit longer residual, but in general, you get about 14-day protection before the fungicides start to break down. All righty, next slide. Just to give you an idea, there are some new fungicides available. I'm not sure if there's any consultants or growers listening to the webinar, but we're looking at Prosaro Pro. It's a new product by Bayer. It actually has 3 different modes of action. Spherix is a new product by BASF, and Miravis Ace is a product that is also produced by Syngenta. And then you have your generics. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of these generics are still pretty effective, maybe not as effective, but still effective for managing these rust diseases. Okay, next slide. All right, let's just switch gears. I just want to kind of talk about the signs and symptoms of stripe rust. It's caused by Puccinia striformis. It's also, as all rust are, they're obligate parasites. It's going to develop, it's a cooler season rust. It's also referred to as yellow rust. You'll see the lesions, pustules are a little lighter colored as compared to leaf rust. 4 to 25 degrees Celsius. So it can actually it can develop very slowly, grant you, at freezing temperatures, but usually around 40 to 77 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is actually becoming more of an issue in our wheat here in Louisiana. Again, you have about the same hours of leaf wetness. Initial symptoms and signs are similar to that you would see with leaf rust, but more frequently than the leaf rust, I can see we've seen this rust develop earlier in the growing season because it can develop at cooler temperatures. Okay. Next slide. Oh, there again, just to emphasize the stage that's most important as far as stripe rust on wheat is concerned is going to be the asexual Uridinea spores. Very similar to leaf rust, about a 7 to 14 day latent period, so a very aggressive disease as well. Okay. Losses to stripe rust can vary from USDA estimates from 2014 to 16 across the United States, and certainly it's going to vary by state, almost 0.5% to a little bit over 7%. I went back and looked at some of my tests, and of course we grow susceptible varieties. Losses range from close to 20 to a little over 40%, and they averaged 34%, which was several percent higher than that we see in my test with leaf rust. Okay. As I mentioned earlier, you get these pustules. If you look in the upper left-hand corner, the kind of lighter colored, linear looking, and that's hence the name stripe rust. And as the disease progresses, those pustules develop in a linear fashion along the leaf blade. Again, they coalesce. Next slide. And can cause desiccation. This is a close-up. Actually, you can see all the dusty spores on the leaf blade as well as the pustules, individual pustules. Okay. It too develops in the lower canopy. If you look over where Andrew has the pointer here, this was a test that we saw early development, quite severe, in one of my tests up at the northeast part of the station where I used to be located. And again, those lesions coalesce in the middle picture on the lower, causes desiccation resulting in reduced yield. again, I mentioned, and I'll kind of end with this slide, they don't discriminate. You got stripe rust here, and you have leaf rust developing on the same leaf. So I hope I provided some information that would be useful. Certainly reach out to your local county agent or your extension specialist if you have any questions. This was a picture I took this year, actually. I got lucky, and I think it's a pretty cool picture. So I just want to thank you and wish you all the best as we progress into 2022. Hard to believe. And there's my lovely family. And that's my grandson right there. He's half Cajun and half redneck. So we're expecting another one soon. Thank you a lot for letting me visit with you, and y'all have a great day.
Well, thank you, Boyd. Appreciate the update on some of the rust diseases that we commonly face in the U.S. And just to quickly change gears here, now we're going to move up to Kansas, and I'm going to pass it on to Dr. Kelsey Anderson and Offred to speak on some of the issues that they deal with.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Well, I'm going to pick up a little bit where we just left off. I'm going to talk for a moment about stripe rust, one of our big problems here in Kansas, especially over the last decade. And then I'll switch gears and talk a little bit about some fungal leaf spot disease issues we have in wheat in Kansas. I want to do a shameless bit of self-promotion here and just mention that we have a Twitter account in the lab at KSU Wheat Disease, and you can follow us there for real-time updates throughout the season and really see what's going on in Kansas wheat. So can you, next slide, please? So just a bit, again, of background about Kansas. We have the country's largest production of hard red winter wheat. So you can see us right there, dead center in the middle of the nation. And really the bulk of our production is that hard red winter wheat market class. So that's all-purpose flour and some other types of wheat. So you can see there that we have parts of Kansas where you can look in all directions and you see wheat production. So it's a big part of the state and a big part of the economy. Next slide, please. Next slide. And that makes up about, back one. We're on a bit of a lag here. So that makes up about 27% of the nation's winter wheat production total. So next slide. So we really do worry about those two rust diseases that Dr. Padgett just mentioned there. So we do have leaf rust, and that typically comes at the end of our season. So it really depends on how warm our season is and when it actually warms up. So we're kind of in an arms race. If we have a cooler early season, we worry more about stripe rust right around that flag leaf period, and that will typically come in first. And that disease, as Dr. Padgett just mentioned, favors that cool, wet weather. So when we have these extended periods of wet canopy, that's when we're really worrying about stripe rust. Leaf rust, on the other hand, you can see, I won't talk much about the symptoms because they were just mentioned, but the pustules are in more of a scatter shot across the leaf, and that, again, is favoring those warmer temperatures. So we're watching those two, and that really does impact how we make our fungicide decision here in Kansas. Next slide, please. So I'll talk just now about stripe rust. This past season, stripe rust was one of our biggest yield loss issues, and probably over the last 2 years here in Kansas. In 2011, we did have a resistance breaking event here in this part of the country. So a lot of our varieties that were more resistant became more susceptible, and this has been something that's been of emerging and increasing concern in our part of the world over recent years. Next slide, please. So typically, we followed this pattern this year in Kansas. So we track stripe rust. We watch our neighbors to the south really closely. What happens in Texas and Oklahoma will drive what happens here in Kansas. And then our friends to the north in Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota watch, I think, what happens here to see how bad our stripe rust pressure will be across the country. So this year, We did detect stripe rust for the first time April 16th on that southern border of Kansas. Here in our map, you see green is where we didn't observe stripe rust yet, and yellow is when we're just starting to see those stripes occur on our lower leaves. And we're monitoring pretty closely. And this is an effort that's not only myself and my colleagues here at K-State, but crop consultants and agents as well. We try to get that information out as quickly as possible. Next slide, please. And if you notice, by April 20th, we're starting to see additional observations in western Kansas. Next slide, please. By April 26th, we have observations in central Kansas, still on the lower leaves. Next slide, please. If we're moving towards the end of April, now we're getting into the upper canopy. So when we have stripe rust in the upper canopy, that's when we're really going to be worried about our yield loss. Next slide, please. And by May 6th, you can see we were up at the Nebraska border. So that period of time is really when our producers are going to be making their fungicide decisions. Next slide, please. So we talked a good amount about symptoms, but typically what you'll see first is that classic striping symptom with orange spores. So if I'm talking to a group of kids, I'll say you can rub that off with your finger and you'll get that Cheeto dust orange spore on your hands. But if you do walk through that field you see there on the right, if you did have stripe rust that was that bad, you'd have those spores coming off on your pant legs or your boots, for example. So luckily, we don't have infections that are so severe like you're seeing on the right, because we do have good genetics and we do have good fungicides, right? Next slide, please. And one thing that's important when we're thinking about the fungicide decision is that stripe rust can infect at any point during the growing season. So typically the weather has to be correct. We have to have that moisture, but you can see early infections. You can even see infections this time of year. It's been a bit warm, but usually those will die off, and you'll see infections earlier in the season. But next slide, please. When we're thinking about a fungicide application, if you click through, that would be good. What we're really thinking about is protecting that flag leaf. So that flag leaf, or that last leaf, is really the driver of a large percentage of our yield in wheat, 70 to 90%. And so that leaf is really the engine of our yield. And so when we're making our fungicide decision, it's important to apply that fungicide either at or after flag leaf to get our maximum potential. And I think Dr. Padgett touched on this a bit, but I would just highlight that in our trials, we see that maximum benefit when that application is made at or after that flag leaf emergence. Next slide, please. And not only are we worried about timing, but we also want to think about varieties and resistance. So we're seeing the most benefit when we're applying a fungicide to a more susceptible variety. So every year we compile a lot of data here in Kansas, and we publish ratings about our main varieties, and you can see that here in this document. Next slide, please. But really our recommendation is that varieties with resistance greater than 5, so here we have 9, which is very, very susceptible, and 1, which is so resistant you'll never see a pustule on it, and 5 is somewhere in the middle. And if we have a variety with a rating that's greater than 5, we're going to see a maximum benefit from that application. We're going to start to see it pay off. Next slide, please. So when we're thinking through that fungicide decision, right, when I get this call and it happens in a kind of a short window when those flag leaves emerge during our spring season, this is really what we're talking through. So we're asking the question, do we have a variety with resistance, right? So what's that rating on a 1 to 9 scale? And is it greater than a 4 or a 5? That's when we're going to start to be a little bit nervous about protection. We want to look at those maps and see, has stripe rust been reported locally? So is it in the county, and has it been scouted in my field, right? These are our key issues. We really want to catch that application before we have high levels of stripe rust, right? Because the damage will be done. And then we want to look at the weather, right? So are we having these periods where we have this wet, cool weather forecasted out into the next couple of weeks? And that, if we have all those conditions met, that's really when we're going to start to see that fungicide application paying off. Next slide, please. So here's an example of some of our fungicide trials from this past season. This was in one location here in Kansas, and you can see from that top bar that our non-treated check had very high levels of disease. So that was about 80% disease. So this was a bad year where we had really good conditions for striped rust. And one of the if you click on the next, and click once more. So here you can see that we had two different application timings. So that one timing that was made at flag leaf, we had Preaxor, Tilt, Delaro, Top Guard approach, Nexacor, Trivapro, Teddy Star, and Quilt XL applied at that flag leaf timing. So that's right when that flag leaf has emerged. And you can see that that provided really excellent protection across the board in all of those products. And that's what we expect. A lot of these products have been tested in multiple states and have shown a very good efficacy if applied on time. And that was before we started to see symptoms, right? So the timing is key. It's not so much the product for striped rust. A lot of these products, they do work really well, even our generics. And even a bit later, when there were two products applied at early flowering, those provided similar protection to our flag leaf application in this scenario because of when there was onset. Next slide, please. But when we're thinking about our protection, right, we really want to think about yield. And this jives with what Dr. Padgett mentioned. In this particular trial, we saw a response of up to 30%. So our fungicides provided 30% yield protection compared to our non-treated check. And in this graph, you can see our non-treated is at the bottom there in terms of yield. There wasn't too much difference between the individual products. Can you click for me, please? And I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done so many animations when I was having someone click. So Andrew, I'm putting you to work here. Thank you. Yeah, click again, once more, that's good. So here we saw 30% yield protection. And what that translated into was approximately 20 bushels per acre when we had our applications made on time, right? So if we had a year like this year where our grain prices were good and we were getting about $5.50 per bushel, maybe say that's generous. Well, we made back $110 per acre. And all of our application costs here in Kansas, plus our product costs, are way below that threshold, right? So even if we applied our more expensive products and we put them on with a plain or in one of our more expensive application costs, we still would have made our money back with any of these products. And that's important. And even if we had had maybe half that yield protection, we still would have made our money back. So in our bad years in Kansas, it's really critical to be making that fungicide application to our susceptible varieties. Next slide, please. Next slide. So I'll point out Crop Protection Network has an excellent publication here. That's a multi-state collaboration. Many of my colleagues here on the line and also colleagues around the country put this together every year with fungicide efficacy. Next slide for small grains, particularly wheat. And you can see here, there's a laundry list of products that have been tested in trials like the one I just presented here. And you can see how individual products rate against different diseases. So for example, in that fifth column over, you can see stripe rust, and there are several products there that are labeled as excellent. So this is a great resource that Andrew works hard to update to every year, and really does have all of that data synthesized across universities. Next slide, please. So I'm going to switch gears very quickly to our foliar leaf spot complex here. So this is so we think a lot about rust here in Kansas, but when we're thinking about foliar diseases, these three fall kind of pretty close down the list. And this is a particular problem in Kansas because you saw, well, there's a lot of wheat produced. And these are issues when we have wheat that's planted into wheat residue year after year because they survive in that crop residue. And when the conditions are correct, we can get bad disease. So the three that we really think about are tan spot, which is a really important one here in Kansas. Septoria triticide blotch, and Staganospora nodorum blotch. And all of these do survive in that residue. Septoria is very diagnostic because you can see the fungal fruiting bodies right there in that center photo in the lesions, and so that can be diagnostic, but these can be tricky to tell apart in the field. And often we actually have more than one of these in the same field, especially when we have that high residue situation. Next slide, please. So I'll talk quickly just about managing tan spot, which is one of the ones we see very commonly here in Kansas. And you can see there on the left-hand side of the screen that's a situation where we have weed after weed. So there's high residue. And we start to see lesions work their way up the canopy. So if we have cool, wet conditions early in the season, we start to see lesions in the lower canopy. And that wouldn't necessarily be a yield risk because those lower leaves aren't major contributors to our yield. But if we get that lower canopy infection, we do produce inoculum. So here on the right side of the screen, you can see our conidia, which are produced in those lesions. And if we have wet conditions, those conidia will flash their way up the canopy and can eventually affect those flag leaves. So in fields where we have high disease pressure, we definitely want to consider a fungicide. You can see there on the bottom, that's a nice picture I grabbed off of the Crop Protection Network. I think it was Mary Burroughs' picture, but maybe it was Emmanuel or Andrews here, so I apologize if I didn't credit this one correctly, but you can see those nice fungal fruiting bodies, and those eject their spores into the canopy and can cause disease. Next slide, please. So when we're thinking about a fungicide application for these foliar diseases, specifically tan spot, our candidates would be fields with high levels of that weed disease residue. You think about varieties that have lower resistance, so we do have varieties that seem to hold their lower canopy greenness better, that will be more resistant to some of these fungal leaf spotters. And I know in a lot of our high pressure fields that those are important traits that producers consider. And we really see these diseases when we have these cool periods with rain early in the season, and particularly when that extends to that flag leaf. That's when we're really going to think about a fungicide decision. Next slide, please. Again, in that Crop Protection Network document, there is a column for tan spot, so that's a great place to go if we're trying to make a decision about the actual product. Next slide, please. I'll share some data quickly from my colleague Dylan Mangal here at Kansas State University. So here you can see on the top our healthy check. So that was a situation where the treatments were applied, fungicide was applied every 2 weeks. So they never had very high disease, and that's an off-label application. We wouldn't make that type of application here in Kansas, but you can see that that's a pretty healthy control. And then at the bottom is an inoculated, untreated check. And you can see those top three products, Twinline, Proline, and Absolute Max, resulted in our lowest disease pressure, and those were not different. So those worked very well when this application was made at peaks 10.2, so at early heading, when that flag leaf was extended. But our other applications, products there worked very well too, right? So we have a lot of products that are very good or excellent for tan spot control. And it really is about making that application decision here. Each of these products protected at least 30 to 40% of severity. So that's an important piece there. Next slide, please. So I'll turn things over here. I know this is a rapid fire webinar, but please feel free to reach out. Again, follow me on Twitter. We'll tweet those real-time updates about stripe rust in our region, or just reach out for any questions. And thank you for the invitation to speak here.
Well, thank you, Kelsey. Appreciate the quick synopsis of what some of the issues you face in Kansas. And now we're going to move north, and I'm going to turn over to Dr. Emmanuel Byamukama to discuss some of the things happening in South Dakota and the things that they worry about.
All right, thank you, Andrew, and thank you, the Agronomy Society, for organizing this webinar. And because of time, I also try to go quickly through these slides. I'll talk about two main diseases, wheat streak mosaic virus and bacterial leaf streak of wheat. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. Sorry, Andrew. All right, so wheat streak mosaic virus, which causes the wheat streak mosaic disease, is one of the major diseases we deal with. And this disease is endemic in the US, having been found in Nebraska in 1922, but it stretches from Texas and all the way to Canada. So it can be really a very serious disease. This is a field in central South Dakota that was completely covered by wheat streak mosaic disease. In fact, this grower had to till the field under and plant something else, so that was 100% yield loss. It's a very, very bad disease. If it comes near wheat, you could lose the entire field. Next slide, please. And so you can see how it really stunts the wheat. You can see here growers are standing in this field, and if you had to combine it, you would have difficulty, picking the wheat. And in fact, when plants are infected this heavy, even if the wheat gets the head, that head will be sterile and will not have viable seed. And so it's really a bad disease. Next slide. So zooming in to look at some of the symptoms. So usually you will see the green and yellow interspersed together, forming like a mosaic pattern on the leaves. And when the symptoms are severe, actually you have the entire leaf etiolated. In other words, there's no green left in it. And definitely you're not making any photosynthesis, and so there won't be any yield. You can see the picture on the right, how plants are severely stunted and with no heads in them. So again, a very bad disease that can really impact wheat yield. I should also state here that we see the main issue of wheat streak mosaic in winter wheat. We see some in spring wheat, but mainly the yield losses we see are in winter wheat. Next slide, please. So this disease is transmitted by wheat caul mites. These are microscopic mites that are blown by wind, either from previous wheat fields or volunteer wheat. And when these land on emerging winter wheat in the fall, and if they happen to carry the virus, and then the transmission will happen. The wheat caul mites are very light, and so they're only moved by wind. They don't have wings. So whenever wind dies is where they will be deposited. And then so they have a limitation of about 2 miles where they can be blown. The other thing we need to know about mites also, they can't survive without a green tissue, at least within 24 hours of being dislodged from the host. And so this is going to be important when we think of managing this disease. Next slide. So the number one risk factor for wheat streak mosaic virus is going to be the pre-harvest hail that's going to encourage the volunteer wheat to come up. And volunteer wheat is going to be the source of both the virus and the wheat caul mites that move this virus. Next slide, please. So as you can see here, it's a common practice in a lot of areas in the Great Plains to have land that's under fallow, especially after wheat harvest. And so if you have pre-harvest hail and you have volunteer wheat come up, then this can be the source of the inoculum, both for the mites and also for the virus. Next slide, please. So another risk factor is where you're planting wheat next to previously planted wheat. You can see here how the next crop, which is neighboring the previous winter wheat crop, is having a lot of disease, which tells us that the source came from the previous wheat field. So as I mentioned, 2 mile radius, unfortunately, is quite a big distance to separate out fields. But if you have wheat planted in such an area and we had wheat streak mosaic virus, you can have this source of inoculum moved around. Next slide, please. So another risk factor, of course, is the weather, especially where we have extended warm fall conditions, whereby the mites might continue being active in the fall. This can lead to severe epidemic outbreaks of this disease. Related to that would be the time of planting. So it's always a game of timing. So if you don't plant early and have good growth, your wheat may not survive winter wheat. But also, if you plant too early, then you could have a risk of wheat streak mosaic virus. So we always recommend to our producers that if in the area we've had epidemics in the summer, probably delay some a little bit of a time such that the mites will not be active when you plant winter wheat in the fall. Next slide, please. So as we saw, the biggest risk factor for wheat streak mosaic virus is going to be the volunteer weed. And so if we can destroy this green bridge, which would be the source where the mites will come from and the virus, then we can effectively control this disease. So we want to make sure that we destroy all the green plants in the field where we're going to plant winter wheat. So that would be volunteer wheat, grass weeds, that are going to be sources of both the virus and the vector. And as I mentioned, the wheat cow mites will only survive for about 24 hours without a host. So if we can destroy the volunteer wheat and give it time to make sure it desiccates and dries so that all the mites will die, that will really significantly control wheat streak mosaic virus. I also mentioned the time of planting being a risk factor. So if we can vary this planting time such that we're planting after most of these mites have died off, that will make a difference, that will lower the risk for this disease. Next, please. So rotation will help to break the disease cycle, and we want to encourage planting of a broadleaf crop, so like soybeans, sunflower, and others, to make sure that we're not continuing to plant a small grain, which can be a host both for the vector, the wood cow mite, as well as the virus. And then variety selection is very important. Like all my colleagues have mentioned, genetic resistance is important in disease management. And for wheat streak mosaic virus, we do have some varieties with good resistance. And we collaborate with wheat breeder to screen varieties to look for the resistance and to recommend which varieties do better under virus pressure. So next slide, please. So in this picture, you can see we do the screening in the greenhouse and also in the field. And so varieties that tend to show heavy symptoms and are stunted and don't yield well, those are not recommended. So you can see in the right picture, one of the varieties is looking pretty good, less symptoms, and those varieties will also yield well. So we do publish the results on the crop performance tests to show which varieties have a better rating for various diseases. So we'd recommend for producers and crop consultants and agronomists to check in this website, SDSU agronomy website, where we post the results for screening. So then next I will talk about another disease that we deal with here in South Dakota and also North Dakota. Pretty much in Northern Plains, we tend to see a lot of bacterial leaf streak. It's a bacterial disease that's transmitted by, that is caused by Pseudomonas translucens, Pathova andulosa. This bacteria actually survive on the seed. It can survive on stubble, wheat residue, and rarely in the soil as well. So this disease can be really significant. As you can see, it tends to affect the upper leaves, which are the main contributors to yield, and so it can cause significant yield loss. So what we're trying to do in this project, actually, I collaborate with Dr. Friskop up in North Dakota, is try and minimize the yield loss either by looking at varieties or also looking at some of the products that could control the disease. But as you can see here on the left picture, when we zoom in, we see really significant symptoms on the upper leaves, again, which are going to cause yield reductions. So just to describe the symptoms, the bacteria tends to cause these brown streaks. They're longer between veins, and sometimes then they can coalesce, as you can see here, causing almost the entire leaf to die. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, this is a collaborative project we're working on with North Dakota. And one of the things we're testing, these products that are called nanomaterials. So we see that some of the these products have been tested on other crops and they seem to be disrupting bacteria. And here we tested these materials in vitro in the lab, in the growth media. And what we've seen is that copper nanomaterial is really doing well compared to the zinc oxide and magnesium oxide. So we compared that to agromycin, which is like the standard antibacterial compound for agricultural products. So there may be some promise with copper oxide. So next slide, please. So I want to go into details to explain how we do this, but you can see on the left where we have nanocopper, really it prevented bacteria from growing as compared to the non-treated on the right, excuse me. Next slide, please. So we've tested these products also in the field, and you can see where we didn't put anything on the inoculated check. We had significant BLS severity develop. Surprisingly, the zinc nanomaterial that we applied in the field tended to increase BLS in the field. So that is something that kind of confused us, but we're going to repeat this to make sure we confirm that. But as you can see from this graph, most of these products tended to lower the level of bacteria in wheat. Next slide, please. And this is a slide from Andrew. As I mentioned, we're collaborating on this project. And here we're comparing the response of various varieties. These are 18 varieties that are commonly grown in the area. And Boost variety is like the standard against bacterial leaf streak. So that's the second variety on the graph. And you can see where the orange bars are showing the level of disease in inoculated plots. And you can see that the Boost had the lowest disease level. And when we compare the yield difference, that is the difference between inoculated and non-inoculated, we see that Boost had a minimum yield difference, which means whether it has disease or no disease, the yield is about the same. But where you see the blue bars being higher, that means the yield loss is pretty significant. So again, if we look at variety differences, some of these varieties are doing pretty well against bacterial leaf streak. So next slide, please. So looking at some of the management recommendations, definitely using certified disease-free seed is important. As we mentioned, this disease, the pathogen can come from seed. We need to rotate again to break that disease cycle, to include non-horse, especially broadleaf crops. And then variety selection is important. And then for in-season products that can control bacterial leaf streak, unfortunately, we don't have anything yet, or that we have concrete data to show the efficacy. We're still doing a lot of testing to see what products could be effective. So I apologize, I had to go through this quickly because of time, but this is the work we're doing on those two diseases that we're dealing with. So the next slide is to acknowledge our sponsors that help us with the work we're doing. The BLS project is funded by USD and IFA, and the work on wheat streak mosaic virus is funded by the South Dakota Wheat Commission. So thanks all for joining us today. I hope there'll be some time to answer questions you may have.
Thank you, Emmanuel. I appreciate the three speakers condensing some thoughts, and I'm going to turn it over to Chris to see if we have some questions from the audience today.
Yeah, Andrew, thanks. We do indeed have some questions coming in, folks. If you still want to submit some, we do have some time. We might get through these quick enough that we could hit them all. So here we go. I'm just going to start at the top of the list, and we're going to go by time of when these questions were asked, and hopefully that helps each of you understand maybe which question is directed to who. So the first one, I believe, was brought in or asked when Boyd, you were presenting, and the person asked, how do you prevent systemic fungicides from contaminating grain and roots? And maybe that's applicable to all the speakers. They could comment.
I really don't know. I haven't really looked at that. Maybe some of the other speakers can address that. We haven't really had any issues with that. Have y'all had any issues with that, Kelsey or Emmanuel or Andrew?
So I want to think that as long as we follow the pre-harvest interval, there shouldn't be issues of the fungicide going into the seed or stubble. I have noticed in our plots, where we apply a fungicide, that definitely that stubble remains, disease-free without any saprophytes on those. But I think as far as the product going into the grain, we just have to follow the pre-harvest interval.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think Boyd presented some nice data too about fungicide residual life. So the lifetime of those fungicides does decrease pretty quickly with time, over 2 or 3 weeks. And so if you do follow that pre-harvest interval, which is typically 30 days or the end of the flowering window, you should be, your grain should be safe for consumption. That's probably the only answer I think we have for that.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks to each of you for contributing. Appreciate it. This is a general question. I believe, though it came in at a certain time, I don't think it matters who answers it, but I'll leave it open for each of you. Do you see soil-borne wheat mosaic virus in association with wheat streak mosaic virus, or are the environments unique to each?
All right, I'll try to answer that question, but anyone else can contribute. So here where I am in South Dakota, I've actually not come across the soil-borne mosaic virus. They have different conditions that favor them. The soil-borne is actually transmitted by a fungus that lives in soil, and the wheat streak mosaic virus is transmitted by wood cow mite. So these are two different vector systems, and the symptoms, though, are pretty close, so it's kind of difficult to tell them apart. The soil-borne also tends to be in wetter areas, low spot areas where you might have water logging, and so those are some of the differences you can use to tell the difference between the soil-borne mosaic and then the wheat streak mosaic virus.
Okay, thanks, Emmanuel. Anybody else want to comment on that, or did he handle it okay for all of your satisfaction? Good. Okay, excellent. I'm gonna move on to something a little bit different here. This question just came in and intrigues me. This person asked, can you comment on the influence of chloride fertilization at spring greenup on increased disease tolerance? Again, influence of chloride fertilization at spring greenup on increased disease tolerance. Anybody want to comment on that question?
So where I don't have any data or studies I've done to look at the effect of chloride on disease resistance, there is information in literature whereby supplemental chloride application did reduce on some of the fungal leaf spot diseases. In fact, where you have deficiency of chloride, you can see a disease mimics that kind of look like a fungal disease. So I believe that in some of the soils where you have nutrient deficiency, supplementing with some of these micronutrients could improve on disease resistance.
Yeah, I'll echo Emmanuel's comments on that. In conversations that I've had with ag professionals, most times when it's in deficient soils, you'll see a bigger response. And part of that could just be familiarity with the field, and in some cases just seeing a better looking crop, which some cases could also reduce disease. But that's two conversations. I don't have any hard data that I can reference or anything like that.
Yeah, I don't either, but I mean anything that would promote plant health and I think would benefit, in any crop.
All right, thank you for commenting. Just one final question then, and I think that's about all we'll have time for before we wrap up for today. This person asked, besides yield loss, is grain quality affected by rust? And that came in, by the way, I think either when Boyd was presenting or maybe Kelsey, maybe the transition point, in fact.
Yeah, I think grain quality can be, the size of the grain, photosynthetic depletion. Kelsey talked about the importance of the flag leaf providing photosynthesis to grain production. It's not going to be anything like Fusarium head blight, but actually stripe rust can infect the heads. Kelsey may want to.
No, I think that's right. You can definitely have reduced test weights and, obviously yield. I'm not sure. Now I'm trying to think through the data on, effects on protein content and those types of traits. And I'm not, I'd have to look at that data again. So I'm not totally sure about that, but absolutely affects yield and test weight and grain size.
Maybe to just emphasize on what Boyd said, that the rusts are not going to cause any mycotoxins. So if that's the worry or if that's the question, the rusts do not cause mycotoxins in grain. I've had this question asked actually on oats, especially when oats are used for feed. And so, yeah, the reduction in quality is going to be in terms of the amount, but not because of the mycotoxins associated with rust pathogens.
All right, thanks to each of you for your comments there, answers to the question. Andrew, I know you kind of led this effort today. Any final comments from you before we wrap up here?
I would just like to thank the organizers of the events, the Crop Protection Network, and also the ASA to make this go. And I just want to thank my presenters today. And if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to us.
Thanks, Andrew. Well, thanks to each of you for presenting today. Much appreciated. Everyone, thank you for joining. Again, this is part of a larger webinar series. Please be joining us for the future webinars brought to us by Crop Protection Network. Their generous sponsorship brings it to you free of charge. So with that, we're going to end for today. Everyone, I hope you have a wonderful day, a wonderful week, and we hope to be with you soon again on more webinars. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Back to you.
Thank you.